I want to tell you all a story today, and it's a story about intimacy, deep time, and a cave. Many years ago, I worked in a cave in the south of France, studying lines people made with their hands on the walls. And this cave had the most amazing acoustics. When you walk in, you can feel your voice reverberating. You can actually feel your breath reverberate. 27,000 years ago, people blew ochre over their hands and left marks on the walls that are still visible today. My favorite among them is one that's unfortunately, due to conservation, faded, but it's the marks of an infant whose hand was held up like this, and the adult had blown the ochre over their hand, and had also caught the wrist of the person who was holding them. Now, when you first walk into this cave, you're in a huge space, and that's where I find all these ochred handprints. And then the ceiling lowers, and crevasses appear above you like reversed mountain ranges. And that's where the lines are that I study. And then as you go in deeper still, you come to a chamber that's filled with engravings. And they're of horses and bison and deer and auroch, and even of a little bird tangled up in this morass of images. And as you go in deeper still, the ceiling comes down, and you come into a chamber that's like a medieval hall with a long, low bench along one side and a cutout in the middle of the wall. And you climb up and over and into this chamber, and it's perfectly round, and it's a chimney in the heart of the cave. And there's 4 engravings around you. The first that you see are the marks made by a Roman centurion 2,000 years ago. And then to your left, you see a dagger that was drawn during the Neolithic 8,000 years ago. There's a cross that was done by the Knights Templar 800 years ago. And then there's a horse just next to you, drawn during the Upper Paleolithic 27,000 years ago. And you're alone in the heart of the cave. So one time I was there with my late husband and my research partner, Kevin, and I wanted to test a theory around acoustics. So I sat in the outer chamber in front of the engravings in the dark, and he sat in the inner chamber in the dark. He had a beautiful voice. And sitting there in the heart of darkness, in the heart of time, I asked him to sing. And the song he sang was Amazing Grace. It filled the cave, and it reverberated outwards. And I felt it not up here in my head or even in my heart, but right here in my solar plexus, as big and strong and beautiful as the words he sang. And it was an extraordinary thing to feel a man's voice reverberate outward through all these chambers of the cave and then back inward through me. Later at the entrance of the cave, I asked our guide, who was there a half a kilometer away, what she heard. And she said, "It's not what I heard. I heard it the same as you." She said, "It's what I felt. I felt it right here, dans mon cœur, in my heart." What I want to talk to you about today is something I call the archaeology of intimacy. I think intimacy is one of the most amazing topics not to be talked about in our time period. I mean, we talk about it in terms of sex and psychology, but we don't talk about it in its real form. That beautiful closeness among people. A good friend recently described it to me as the climbing over of one's own walls to get closer to another. And I loved that image because it reminded me of the way someone's voice could cross all those chambers in a cave to reach someone's heart. Or the way a mother could hold up her child's hand and blow ochre over it for an instant that's lasted for 27,000 years. Now, when you think about archaeology, I always wonder, why do we study the past at all? I mean, really, we're here in the present. And I sometimes wonder if it's because we do want a bit of that closeness. We want to connect somewhere. And maybe we want to reach our hand back and find it met, maybe by somebody who put their hand out 27,000 years ago. Now, I study something called finger flutings. They're actually the residue of touch. They're lines people drew on the walls of caves during the Upper Paleolithic. And today we only find them in France and Spain and Australia. The Upper Paleolithic was a long time ago. I mean, the people I study lived between 15 and 35,000 years ago. So those are huge expanses of time to try to wrap your head around. So what I do is I think about them in terms of great-grandparents. So 20,000 years is 800 great-grandparents back. And the cave with the ochred handprints, why, that's 1,250 great-grandparents back from me to the person drawing the horse in the cave. That's not a lot of people. I mean, when you think about it, that's 4 times as many as are in this room today. Except it's the entire lifetime of each of those people laid end to end to end. So we can think about these people because we are these people. They were a little bit taller than us and a little bit thinner thanks to the paleo diet. And they lived in small groups. And to my knowledge, they never lived inside caves, maybe just at the entrance. But they certainly went into deep caves. And they made art there, and they made marks there. And for the last 100 years, there have been a whole series of theories as to why people did this. Everything from hunting magic to totemic symbols to hallucinating shamans in the dark. But really, there's been an awful lot of, I don't know, that's couched in a lot of language around ritual and religiosity. Personally, I like the I don't knows. Those are the best places. It's where all the good questions lie. It's like a field of untrammeled snow. So when I first started doing this work, this is what I was confronted with. This was a fairly big I don't know. And in the cave we worked in, there was chamber upon chamber of this I don't know that was mixed in with much more recognizable images of lovely mammoths and bison and beautiful smiling woolly rhinoceros. But it was the I don't know that actually drew us. And so we sat with it, first in the light, and then in the dark. And let me tell you, sometimes in the dark you can see things much more clearly. And what we saw was that we too had 101 theories as to what this was. Everything from, it was a rainy day in the Paleolithic, and people went in the caves opportunistically, using the very best tool that they had, and made graffiti. Made sense. Or it was the residue of dance, and what we were sealing on the ceilings wasn't actually even your hands, it was your hips played out through your fingertips. Kevin thought this was writing, and in that he may have been correct. And so we started asking questions around what would be the grammar of this. And to answer the question of, is this writing, we first had to ask the question of who wrote this? And in fact, who did any of this? And at that point, we moved from asking questions about why and what and how to who. And that was wonderful, because in a who, you can go in deep, you can get intimate. So we started studying people's hands. And we were really interested in the width of 3 fingers. And so if you at home were to steam up your shower and run your hands down it, and you would leave the exact same mark that I saw on the cave walls. And that was wonderful. So we got ourselves a hunk of clay and a rolling pin and a ruler, and we went everywhere. We went to schools and elder hostels and college courses in my poor entire village up the road. Literally everybody gave us a hand in this work. And what we found was wonderful, because it turned out that your hand width is unique. And even though your hand may look like your mother's, you actually don't make the same mark that your mother makes. And so we were able to determine individuals. And it turned out that certain widths really mattered. So if your hand had a width of 30 millimeters or smaller, you were never older than 5. That was fantastic, because for the first time ever, we could find children in the caves. And then there was some great research about gender, and it turned out that you could determine men and women and children. And so our work started to move from looking at these big generalizations of people to unique individuals, people we could recognize, people like you and me. So now let me take you back to the caves, because this is where it started to get interesting for me. So up until this point, we thought all of this had to do with ritual, that people had gone to the caves season after season, millennia after millennia, making their mark on the wall, and that these were hundreds and hundreds of people. Except when we were working in Rufignac, I'd be reading the measures off to Kevin, 31 millimeters, 41 millimeters, 28 millimeters. And after a while, we started to notice that we were saying the same numbers over and over. And it turned out that in this enormous cave, there were only 8 people who had done the finger flutings. 8. And in Gargas, the cave with the ochred handprints, it was worse. It was this huge chamber that we thought had been done by hundreds. And it was a tall, left-handed man who made really lousy single-fingered animals with one finger, and a woman with a boy on her hip, and one small infant that they occasionally lifted up. And that was all. After Kevin died, I moved to working in a series of caves in Spain, where, again, the hypothesis was ritual, and again, the numbers were even fewer. And this was the point I was coming to, that previously my work had been about big picture, big cultures, big questions, and meaning. And now my work was about the small, the intimate, the distance it takes to reach out your hand and touch a wall or another person. And I started to be looking for the evidence of the visible and invisible relationships and the small but indelible marks of human kindness. So here I am in the caves, and I'm looking for intimacy. Now, I have to say, some of my colleagues have found intimacy in the caves. And I'm always happy to hear their stories because we always had a guide. It was so unfair. But it turns out human beings always would have gone into the caves for intimacy. Why wouldn't you? My goodness. And in looking at 14 caves in Europe, what we found is that the largest number of people to make their marks on the wall were 9, and that group had a lot of children. And the smallest number were 2. And there were many that were 2. And it was in looking at those pairs of people that we started to see some of the most beautiful stories and of the intimacy of people. So in Gargas Cave, I had 2 people, a mother or a woman with a child on her hip. She's fluting with her left hand. He's fluting with his right. Or in Las Chimeneas in Spain, 5 meters up a very difficult slope above the most beautiful deer drawings in history. 2 people are sitting side by side on a tiny little ledge. One's fluting with their left hand, the other with their right, and they must be passing their lamp back and forth between them in the darkness. Or in Redefining Cave, a 3-meter-long panel of 2 people fluting softly, ending with 2 mammoths facing each other. Now, in the last few minutes I have with you, I want to introduce you to my favorite finger fluter in all of Europe. She's a 4-year-old girl in Redefining Cave, a cave that has the largest number of finger flutings in all of Europe, and she's the 2nd most prolific fluter in that cave. Her hand width is 28 millimeters. It's the width of these 2 fingers. And she's fluted here, and here, and here, and here, and here. She's everywhere, whether you can see her or not, she's there. And these flutings here and here are 1/2 kilometer away from each other. Now I want to focus you in just on this particular panel because I think this helps illustrate the idea of intimacy. Let me show you how she made this. It was like this. Now, for years, I stood in front of this panel doing just that. That's what I do to figure out people's lines. I'd stand in front of them, recreating them. And every time I would work on her marks, I would have to put my torch under my arm because she flutes with 2 hands. And for the longest time, it didn't come to me. I mean, for years I worked in this cave, it didn't come to me. And then one day it did. Why can she flute with 2 hands? Who's holding her light? There's no evidence of fire on the floor in this cave. So there has to be somebody who's there, who's invisible to the final mark she makes, but was visible to her. And that's the person I'm most interested in my work. That's the person I actually want to see. Because I think each of us in our own way in the world, we make our marks. Some of them are big, Some of them are huge, colossal. And some are small, momentary, intimate. Some are the sound of a man's voice reverberating straight into someone's heart. Some are amazing grace. But I propose that if we were to study the past and the present through the lens of relationship and intimacy, we might find a far more hopeful understanding of humanity. Because I think we'd find evidence for what was true in this cave, which is that for each of us, as we make our mark in the world, it's because someone else holds our light. Whether that was 20,000 years ago or today. Sometimes it takes the darkness to see that all the more clearly. Thank you.